Would you let your son wear dresses? Can you stop your son from wearing dresses? Why would you stop your son from wearing dresses? What's the big deal about a child wearing clothes? Isn't it naive to pretend that girls wearing trousers and boys wearing dresses are the same thing? True equality if you're just putting gender ideology onto your child. Oh, don't even start with that gender ideology rubbish. Is it rubbish if someone outside will bully your child? Dresses are comfortable and who cares what small children are wearing? Everyone. You know they're always... Look, shut up, intrusive voices. Go back to TikTok. See? Clothes are just clothes. They're to have fun with. Wait a minute. Oh. That's not... Wait. Oh, that's so mean. What? Oh, that's enough internet for today. Back in the day, you could tell who was a girl and who was a boy. That doesn't seem right. Hello, and welcome to today's artistic review show, Boy or Girl? I'll be showing you 5 paintings, and you at home are going to try and guess if the child in the painting is a boy or a girl. A correct answer is 1 point. Let me know how you do. Now, historically minded Bridgerton fans should recognise this face. It's Queen Charlotte, but who's sitting on her lap? Her son or her daughter? Number 2. A rather solemn child here, though, wearing a sunshine yellow, a lovely full-length gown of yellow satin. But is this a boy or a girl? 3. 1610 to 20, a full-length portrait of an infant standing unnaturally straight and holding a coral rattle in one hand and flowers in the other, wearing a stiff red dress with green sleeves and a black hat. 4. Here we have 2 little angels from the mid-1800s with beautifully pin-curled hair. But tell me, girls or boys? 5. Another painting from the early 1600s. Here we see 3 children, all wearing wide collars and stiff clothes. But how many boys are in the picture? 1, 2, or 3? I won't keep you in suspense. Drum roll, please. Number 1. Who's sitting on Queen Charlotte's lap? It's Prince Frederick, later Duke of York, obviously. And of course, that's George IV at her knee, where he has a bow and a drum. It's of course a boy. Number 2. Who is this solemn child? Why, it's King William III at only 7, and thus still wearing the full skirt of a young boy. That big hat and lack of jewellery make it clear. Number 3. The flowers tell you that yes, this is a girl, and of course it is an infant. It is horrifying. That's an actual baby. 4. An adorable little pair of children called Herbert and Rose. Herbert is the child carrying the drum, probably. Number 5. How many boys are in this picture? Give yourself a mark if you guessed 2. Here we see the children of Frederick V and Elizabeth of Bohemia. Frederick Henry is on the left, his brother Charles Louis is in the centre, and their sister Elizabeth is on the right. Did you play the game well? Did you get it right? Boys wearing dresses is not as new or as subversive as you might think. Disclaimer, do not play this game at home with actual people. I'm doing this to prove a point about children and clothing in history. It is still very much rude to go up to people and try to guess what they are. Before the mid-20th century, it was normal practice to dress male and female children alike until the age of breeching. Technically an 18th century term, but useful to describe the difference. When, at an age generally between 4 and 7, the boys would start to wear bifurcated lower garments, like breeches, shorts, or trousers. Here is Louis XIV with his brother Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, for breeching, and here he is after breeching. There could be subtle distinctions made between boys' dresses and girls' dresses. An older boy's dress might be styled more like a jacket with decorative buttons down the front. And in paintings, coded art language shows us who is a girl and who is a boy, with small ways that, to be honest, if you don't know, you don't know. The art world, exclusionary news that shocks no one. Having grown up spending more of my childhood in museums than in dedicated child spaces, and being a lover of dresses myself, I didn't really have strong gender associations with my toddler's clothes. Wear whatever makes you happy, darling. It's fine. You do you. Especially if you look adorably vintage. So, I have a bone to pick with these TikTok comment sections. Children don't know if they're boys or girls. Boys are dressing like girls. Girls are dressing like boys. You can't tell them apart. They're confused. Won't somebody think of the children? So why were all of these children, boys and girls, wearing white dresses in the 18th and 19th century? And dresses and skirts in general? And is that the only time in modern Western history when children have worn gender-neutral clothing? Time to dismantle some preconceptions. Let's talk about frills, linen, gender-neutral dresses and second-wave feminism, but only a little bit. Hi, for those of you who are new here, I'm Jessica, this is my channel. I do different types of cultural commentary about LGBTQ+ history, disability, chronic illness, and parenting as an intersection of those things. Also vintage fashion. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing. The history of childhood. Nowadays, we have a very clear idea of how different children are from adults, and we think of childhood, teens, and adulthood as distinct and clear parts of life, you know, like The Sims, when we spin around and suddenly we're a foot taller. But the way in which childhood as a concept functions in society has evolved and changed massively across cultures and time, and a lot of aspects that we tend to take for granted as a fundamental part of childhood are actually much more modern than you may imagine. For instance, birthdays were not widely celebrated before the 1890s, which is really a shame for everyone born before then. Yay! Congratulations to me! And it was mostly so people could put to use the Christmas cards they hadn't sent. Waste not, want not. Children's clothes are one of those elements that not only have changed in regards to fashion and materials available to people, but also in terms of the different ideas adults have had about what was healthy and appropriate for a child. Ideas about education, gender, many other things. Like how until the 17th century, British babies used to be constantly swaddled because they thought that this would strengthen the child's limbs. But in mid-1600s it was believed that being bound constantly would weaken the limbs instead. Yeah. So babies started being dressed in little frocks that would hang all the way past their feet and then would be shortened as toddlers became more mobile. Wait, is this where christening gowns come from? How did babies even start learning to move in those things? Oh no, start picturing your 4-month-old in a fitted bodice instead. Really get her ready for that corset. I'm disturbed. This was a time of great change for a way in which children were treated. New 17th century child-rearing methods also encouraged children to avoid harsh physical punishment and show affection. They even suggested that mothers may want to personally supervise their children instead of just leaving them to the servants, and that fathers should also pay attention and care to their offspring as they did to their dogs and horses. This was the bar, people. It's in hell. For rich people, I'm pretty sure the poor ones had already noticed the children they were sharing one room with. You know that little thing with no fur that goes around your estate making humanoid-like noises? That little thing might also want a biscuit and a belly rub and words of affirmation. Some scholars think that this more affectionate way of treating children was because the lower mortality rates made it safer to bond with the child, whilst others think that the increased attention and care children were getting was the cause of the lower mortality rates. I seem to have a lot more children since I started watching them in the bath. The past is truly a mystery. What does seem clear is that this came along with a new way of seeing childhood and children themselves. In the 1500s and 1600s, ideas developed about early life being a state of innocence and purity, and it needed to be protective and kept safe from sin and corruption. And for this reason, parents started paying more attention to the way in which things like education, clothing, and environment affected their child's growth. Do you think if I teach it things, it will actually get smarter? You can see the evolution of these ideas fairly clearly through the history of art. When you look at children in medieval paintings, they always look like small adults. Even if their size is different, the way their clothes and bodies are shown is no different from people of older ages. Look at this 13th century baby Jesus! He would kindly like you to get off his lawn and bring him his newspaper. He haunts me in my dreams. This is because children were thought of not as a separate category of people, but rather as adults who were small. Plus, due to high mortality rates, being a child was considered dangerous, and parents were anxious to see their offspring mature and become adults as soon as possible. Maybe that's also one of the reasons why until the 16th century, children dressed no differently from adults. Remember in my History of High Heels video when I was talking about little girls needing to look like women on their wedding day? As ideas of what children are start coming closer to the modern notion of childhood, we can see the depiction of children change as well in painting. And so, in the 1700s, children are drawn with rounder limbs and more anatomically correct proportions. Less like the idea of a person, and more like an actual child. I got these pictures from an article about medieval paintings of ugly baby Jesuses, and this is the example that they gave for a cute innocent baby. Frankly, I don't think this baby's any cuter than the other one. Babies do look a lot like old men. And this one could do with some vitamin D drops and some iron in his diet. Is he okay? but they're still cute potatoes. Are you a visual planner? Do you love mood boards? Do you just love to put all of your creative ideas into little scraps of paper with the intention of pinning them all on the wall like you're in a detective movie, but then find that you actually lose them because they're flapping just around everywhere and it ends up being really an uncoordinated mess that takes way more time than it should? I have just the thing for you. I have always been a big fan of visual mood boards, and finding Milanote was like finding a shoe that's the perfect fit. I have been using it for a number of months now, so I was overjoyed when they reached out to sponsor today's video. Milanote is the perfect tool for organising creative projects. It's an online canvas that allows you to brainstorm, plan, sketch, list, dump all of your brilliant and wild ideas into one place. I personally really like how easy it is to use as a collaborative visual tool, especially since my editor actually lives in Spain. Hi Clara! Hey! Bet it's really sunny there right now. I find that I focus best on writing and researching videos when I have mapped everything out visually beforehand. How am I getting from point A to point B? Well, with Milanote's various tools, I can streamline and organise my filmmaking process incredibly easily. But that is not all I use it for. And you don't have to feel overwhelmed thinking that you are not a very visually creative person. Hey now, I felt that self-doubt. You back it up. Because Milanote not only can be used for a range of different projects, but it has some great built-in templates to get you started. There are over 100 built-in templates available for every type of creative project, from a weekly planner to a craft project timeline, to a wedding mood board, to an Eisenhower matrix to make you feel productive. I am just currently building a new website, and I actually found the template that Milanote has was so helpful to get me started rather than just staring at a blank canvas and feeling overwhelmed. I actually used the content creation video plan template to get me started on this video that you are watching. Haha, I am not kidding. I genuinely use Milanote to plan and organise all of my creative projects. I like to have the board start as a main jumping off point. I've put the main video theme over here, a sort of explanation of breaching at the bottom, but mainly I found myself most inspired by these paintings of young boys. Look at adorable little Prince Ulrich, juxtaposed with the harsh comments left on modern TikTok videos of boys wearing dresses, as if this is some incredibly new phenomena and not the norm for much of history. Whether you are a writer, interior designer, filmmaker, student, or just a very visual person, Milanote is designed to help you organise your work and share it with others easily. You can invite your colleagues, friends, or students to view the project and collaborate with them in real time. Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so just sign up for a free Milanote account using the link in the description. It's free! Did you catch that? Free! It's free, friends! 18th century to 20th century, dresses for everyone. So, were boys in the 18th and 19th century dressed as girls? No. First things first, what boys were dressed as was children. They were not dressed as girls. Because how could they be dressed as girls? Every child wore a dress. In the words of Joe B. Paoletti, author of Pink and Blue, telling the boys from the girls in America, in order for a child's garment to be gendered, there must be a lexicon of visual cues or patterns of use that are widely understood to be unambiguously masculine or feminine. Without those cues or patterns, the objects are interpreted as neutral, meaning acceptable for both boys and girls. For example, a plain white t-shirt in the 1940s was a masculine garment based on patterns of use, not its design. At the time, t-shirts were undergarments worn nearly exclusively by men and boys. The same shirt in 2010 is neutral because patterns of use have changed to make t-shirts a staple wardrobe item for women and girls as well. Am I dressed as a man? So there's nothing specifically about what a piece of clothing looks like that makes it masculine or feminine, and the same type of fabric wrapped and cut around a body can mean different things at different times in history. It's all about context. In the 1800s, both genders wore dresses as infants and young children, so seeing a baby or a young child in a frilly white dress would not have made people around them identify this child as a boy or a girl, just a child, because that's what children wore. Because children were not meant to do the things that adults did, and so it was not necessary for them to wear anything that indicated masculinity. All small children were understood to be innocent and vulnerable. White linen or cotton also made dirt easy to find and could more easily be scrubbed, bleached and boiled without losing its colour. So you know, it's symbolic, but it's also because baby clothes need to be cleaned regularly, because small children just won't be stopped. This is actually my reasoning for preferring pale clothes and towels. You can always tell when they're dirty. Also, white doesn't really show up baby spit in the way that black does. Just saying. During the late 18th century and early 19th century, until around 1815, women, girls and little boys all dressed similarly, with the high, empire-waisted gowns of light silks and cottons. Infants' long dresses were layered, overtop undershirts and sometimes petticoats. By the time children started crawling and becoming more active, mothers began putting them in shorter, knee-length dresses. Boys' hair would also be kept in long curls until they were breeched. That is, until they were considered old enough to start wearing breeches or eventually trousers and adopt a male hairstyle. By the 1760s, the bodices and petticoats worn by children were replaced with ankle-length frocks. So yes, children's clothes also included stiff bodices and stays like adults did, until someone decided that was probably not a great idea. Gosh, the children seem to be running much faster now they can breathe. I don't know if this was a good idea. There was no strict age of breeching, but rather parents would decide when the child looked mature and masculine enough to start wearing trousers, as they believed the child would just eventually show his nature without having to be taught to be manly. It was actually not encouraged to breech the child too soon, as it may produce sexual precociousness. Also, advice from the 1800s warned against dressing boys too early in trousers, precisely because it was thought that dresses offered more freedom of movement than the jacket and trouser combination of the period. Which is interesting, given that most people tend to think of trousers as the more active wear. I guess it depends on what you are doing with your freedom of movement, but this is actually a very vindicating moment for me because I like to wear dresses and skirts all the time, and I find that it allows me far more movement than anything else. I can roll around on the floor with my toddler. I can scramble over fences on a dog walk. Yes, I can happily roll around on a floor in a playground. Why am I on the floor? Don't ask why I am unable to stay upright for any length of time. In the words of a post in the blog The Cornell Fashion and Textile Collection, as children's societal roles evolved in the early 1800s, formal education was delayed and children were viewed as innocent, clean slates who needed to engage in play in order to properly mentally and physically develop. Children were not rushed into adulthood, but instead encouraged to enjoy this pure youthful phase, in trying to keep children as innocent and sexless for as long as possible. Boys kept wearing tunic dresses until the 1860s. From the 1860s to the 1880s, boys from 4 to 7 wore skirted outfits that were usually simpler than girls' styles, with more subdued colours and trim or masculine details such as the vest. They would not wear full trousers even after breeching, but short pants or knickerbockers, which is not information that you necessarily needed. I just wanted to say the word knickerbockers. Sounds like the name of an enterprising mouse, Mr. Knickerbockers. Look at this. This is fashion. Eat your heart out, Harry Styles. This small Victorian child wore it better. I'm sorry. The breeching age would initially be around 7 years old, but would eventually be brought down as the mass production of smaller sizes of children's clothes offered more clothing options to younger boys. Although toilet training did, of course, play a role in each individual child's breeching age. Unlike boys, as 18th century girls grew older, their clothing did not undergo a dramatic transformation, though the cut and style would change with age. But as the century advanced, fitted bodices with full skirts became the fashion for adult women. Given that we're seeing all the array of children's fashion that the modern age has to offer, I would be remiss not to mention that even though young children started wearing more and more colour as mass-produced clothes and material became more accessible, pink and blue were not given to girls and boys respectively. Pink and blue were associated with gender by the 1910s, and there was early efforts to codify the colours for one sex or the other, but as late as 1939 it was considered that because pink was actually a pale shade of red, the colour of the war god Mars, it was actually very appropriate for boys, yes, while blue's association with Venus and the Madonna made it the colour for girls, though in practice, the colours were used interchangeably for both young boys' and girls' clothing until the World War I, really. So, it's clear that the little white dress was the gender-neutral garment that every child wore in their early years, and that everyone would have seen a boy wearing a frilly dress, or later on a tunic or a skirt, and not batted an eye about it. So, why did I say that they didn't dress like girls, but also they did dress like girls? Well, Even though fashion advanced in different directions, and both boys' fashion and adult women's fashion would change, the origin of the dress is in a time when young children's clothing and women's clothing were part of a similar category. It makes sense that in terms of clothing, children and women would be put in the same box, as neither children nor women were considered to be able to fend for themselves without the support of their families and of men. They were both considered to be innocent and weak. So much has changed. So, we have historically connected both femininity and childishness with the inability to be fully functioning members of society, to make decisions or to speak up for themselves. This is probably why in so many languages, boy, girl or child have been terms used historically to refer to servant, because regardless of the age of a servant, they were not seen as equals, but as being less than, in a way not adult enough to be publicly relevant. Boy, as a word itself, was originally used as much to indicate a power dynamic as to indicate age difference for several centuries, and that would remain the case after the 1800s, particularly in the context of the United States, as the term acquired racial connotations. It became not just a marker of class difference, but one of the difference in status between white and black people. Childishness is still not only used to demean people based on gender, class or race. You must be wondering, what else could it be used to demean? Jessica, this is getting out of hand. Yes, it's people with disabilities. A prize for those of you in the back. People with disabilities, both physical and intellectual, are often infantilized. Think of how people sometimes describe those with cognitive disabilities as childlike, or how they see them as unfinished, pure adult, or how uncomfortable some are with the notion that disabled people may have sexual drive or attraction because, well, aren't they just like children? Isn't that wrong? In the words of Alison, Kefer, Associate Professor of Feminist Studies at the University of Texas, the linkage of intellectual disability with childhood has a long history. Within this framework, there is no room for the adult with intellectual disabilities. If adulthood is about independence, autonomy, and productivity, then adulthood becomes both unachievable and inconceivable in relation to profound intellectual impairment. What defines independence anyway? Well, how do I know if I have it? Well, I suppose if I'm asking, it means I definitely don't. So, it is true that small boys have historically worn dresses for hundreds of years, but it is important that as we move on to consider dresses as gender-neutral items that anyone can wear, we don't do it exclusively because boys wore them, so they are not feminine, but rather because in the year of our Lord 2024, we've come to the conclusion that actually using whatever people wear to determine if someone is a fully functioning member of society or not is just not acceptable. Actually wearing things that other people may consider feminine doesn't mean one is not a full person deserving of respect. We are hopefully better at gender than 18th century British aristocrats. Also, since we use child to refer to someone not being worth listening to or whose opinions are meaningless, we should also make sure that when we listen to children, we remember that they are also people who deserve respect and autonomy. Yes, even people with no object permanence who need a nap deserve respect and autonomy. An attempt at gender neutrality, 1970s and the birth of unisex. In the early 1800s, white dresses were meant to highlight the innocence and dependence of young children, regardless of gender. After a certain age, some of those children would be assumed to be ready to let go of that more feminine attribute and start wearing trousers, and others would continue to be considered dependent for the rest of their lives and keep wearing dresses and frills. Before ending this video, I want to briefly compare gender-neutral dresses to a moment a bit later in history, when parents started making an active effort to dress their children gender-neutrally, and how that attempt is linked to the way in which ideas of childhood, femininity, and innocence were understood, and how these ideas are not necessarily negative or positive, but just something that affects the things we wear and what we think about them in complicated ways. I mean, I do think that believing someone doesn't have a right to autonomy because they're an innocent blob is wrong. I just mean that how ideas about what gender means don't just disappear, and we need to be careful about our biases. Let's give it a bit of a jump to a groovier time. Wait, is that word from the 60s? It's the 70s we're talking about. The 1970s were a period full of contested points of view about how to raise a child. The opinion that gender and sexuality could be influenced by the child's environment as opposed to being natural had become the general position. But there were multiple theories about what social roles children should be taught and how, in part inspired by the feminist interest in challenging the idea of gender being immutable. There was an explosion of unisex clothing that even included the invention of the term unisex in 1968, a term used for both children and for adults. For adults, unisex clothing was not actually meant to look androgynous. The styles were often tight and form-fitting. Like this ad indicates, the goal of unisex styles was in part to highlight the differences between male and female adult bodies. Everyone looked sexy with the same clothes because you could see how they look underneath it. Ooh! Obviously this doesn't work for children. The same style and cut of clothes just emphasises the almost lack of physical difference in children. 4-year-olds are just 4-year-olds. You're only saying he and she by making an educated guess based on hair and clothing. Second-wave feminism, which influenced ideas of gender-neutral parenting in the 70s, believed firmly that gender is socially constructed, and that if children were brought up with no gender stereotyping, they would overcome sexism. Unclear as to how that would fix the rest of the world, but okay. There were several experiments and discussions about what it would be like to create a child with no learned gender bias. There was even a novella published in 1972 called X, A Fabulous Child's Story, where a child is raised as neither a boy or a girl and becomes the most popular child in their school. Let me know how that's going. I like how these people all pretend that they're so super fine with gender neutral things, so fine, and that they're the ones getting all angry on Twitter. You couldn't tell what X was by studying its clothes. Overalls didn't even button right to left like girls' clothes, or left to right like boys' clothes. You couldn't guess if X had a girl's short haircut or a boy's long haircut. What is that magic haircut? By the 1980s, the unisex craze had disappeared, but until then, children's clothes briefly became part of the experiment. Through the 50s and 60s, young girls' clothes had mostly consisted of dresses, with more gender-neutral clothes for play. But now trousers would become a go-to option for many boys and girls. Unisex styles for children included loose clothes like ponchos, cafcans, and sweater vests. Boys were once again allowed to let their hair grow, and boys' clothes started to include more patterns and colours. You got colours, boys! Wow, good for you. This was understood as part of teaching children to grow up with more freedom about their gender roles and letting children, particularly girls, know that they could do whatever they set their minds to. In the words of Jo Paoletti in Sex and Unisex, Fashion, Feminism and the Sexual Revolution, one interesting feature of unisex clothing for children was not only the phenomenon of designers of girls' fashions borrowing styles from the boys' department, but also girls actually buying boys' clothes. Sears acknowledged this practice by including size conversion charts in the boys' pages of its catalogue. Earnshaws reported in 1978 that as much as 25% of boys' jeans and pants were actually sold to girls. Probably wanted pockets. The practice also apparently reversed, though not to the same extent. One manufacturer of girls' stretch pants and tops increased his business when he realised that mothers were buying the comfortable, easy care garments for little boys and started including boys in his ads. Wow, boys like to be comfortable. Who knew? You could see this movement for a more gender-neutral approach to child-rearing, not just in the way people dress their children. Toy aisles and catalogues also turned towards a greater gender neutrality. Although gender in children's toys ads became prominent around World War II, in the 1970s, the distinction between boys' toys doesn't sound quite right. Toys for boys and toys for girls had almost disappeared from marketing. When one looks at catalogues from the time, such as Sears, 70% of toys advertised show no marks of gender, and toy ads often showed girls building and playing with aeroplanes or boys in the kitchen. But then, the return to hyper-gendered toys came in the 1980s when advertising was deregulated, meaning that toy companies became able to advertise through programs that worked like 20-minute-long ads, like Transformers or My Little Pony, which is something we would not do nowadays. And these were all very clearly meant to be differentiated by gender, creating a division in the toy market. Think of He-Man and She-Ra. It doesn't get more gendered than that. Fun fact, when the She-Ra action figure came out in 1985, toy shops didn't know whether to stock it with boy toys like He-Man or with girl toys like Barbie. For those people who complained that the new version of She-Ra was just not feminine enough, this article in a hobby magazine from 1985 talks about blending of identities and the greying between male and female. Yes, 1985 She-Ra had both hair you could brush and gender soared, and that was already pushing too much between genders for some. A gender non-conforming icon. By 1995, the level of separation between toys being advertised for boys and girls had gone back to interwar period levels, which again tells you how quickly things that we assume have always been the state of affairs can change. Yes, another preconception dismantled for you if you had it. Even though the intention between the gender neutrality in clothes and toys came from a wish to bring up children with no gender stereotyping, there were still some issues around the framing of sexuality and gender roles with the 70s gender-neutral approach to education, particularly when it came to sexuality, even though generally attitudes towards LGBT behaviour were not extremely negative. Some writers who defended gender-neutral parenting argued that actually not shaming your child for being gender non-conforming or not raising them with strong gender roles would help prevent homosexuality in the long term. Wait, what? It's a take, to say the least. Not where I saw this going. It is true that psychiatrists who opposed gender-neutral child rearing accused gender-free education and androgynous clothes of confusing children about their sexuality, but I don't know if that is the best response to that claim. I guess this is why I'm a lesbian. I just gendered too hard. Also, even though the clothes are colourful and hip, the frills and bows and skirts from earlier eras are left behind as both boys and girls adopted trousers. Hang on. That second wave feminism wanted to empower girls, but also considered things like dolls, toy kitchens, pink tutus, frills and glitter, symbols of the objectification of women and tools of oppression. So a lot of discussion around it ended up with the same idea that we saw in the 19th century, that femininity is a problem in itself and not the way in which people treat those who present in feminine ways or the way in which it is enforced. I want my children to feel happy expressing themselves however they want. I don't want them to feel shame. Well, yes, that's good parenting. We should all get to wear tutus and pink if we want. Why does neutral have to be trousers when before it was dresses? And where did we get this idea that femininity is the problem? Well, one would hope. I grew up in the 90s and I felt a lot of shame around my innate love of pink frills, to the extent that I was probably a 7-year-old enologue who could discuss classic literature or the 9 o'clock news, but would sneer at the mention of a Barbie doll. Gosh. Obviously nothing stopped my love of the Spice Girls though, don't worry about that. In conclusion, the idea of gender-neutral clothing for children is in no way new. In the 1800s, all young children were considered part of the same category: innocent, dependent, and pure. And so it made sense for all of them to dress like women did, or for women to dress like children. And even when this notion of femininity and childhood disappeared, boys kept wearing dresses for a long time, without anyone worrying that it was going to affect the way they would grow up. In the 1970s, feminist parents and educators wanted to make sure that both boys and girls felt like they had the same potential and ability to do things, and as part of that, they embraced unisex, gender-neutral clothing. Sadly, in a context where neutrality and masculinity were kind of interchangeable. This mostly meant getting rid of things that they saw as too feminine, because feminine-coded objects were themselves a mark of vulnerability. No dolls for you. That is, even though the movement was explicitly dedicated to empowering women and girls, they still very much were affected by those 18th century ideas that saw femininity and childishness as kind of the same thing, and actually reinforced the idea that femininity indicated a child was not ready or not capable to be a member of society, or that they should be seen that way. So maybe it is actually a positive thing that now people are embracing as part of their wardrobe dresses, bows, pink, frills, etc. Not just because dresses can be gender neutral, but because we now understand that there is nothing negative about wearing things that have historically been seen as feminine, regardless of who you are. Now we understand that it was actually wrong to associate wearing ruffles and flounces with not being deserving of as much respect as everyone else. I mean, it genuinely sounds like a really silly concept when you say it out loud. Clothes have no gender. Clothes can be whatever we want them to be. They allow us to play and express ourselves and tell the world how we want to be seen. Do you really want to take away from children half of all that potential and possibility? I mean, look at this. How could you tell anyone not to wear this? Boys have been wearing dresses for a very long time, but maybe this time we can be actually nice about everyone wearing dresses as a society, or at least we can try. In style.